Hi, this is Michael Jones, Chairman and CEO of Caravel Concepts. Welcome to Market Insights, our weekly commentary on financial markets and economic events. Let's get started. In last week's video, we laid out the long 3,000-year historical background for the current conflict between the Israeli government and Palestinians. This week, we're going to narrow the focus into the events since World War II, the very specific items that have led to the intractable conflict that continues to roil global financial markets and create so much misery in the Middle East. So, it's 1945 and World War II is over. Millions of Jews have been murdered in the Holocaust. Hundreds of thousands of shell-shocked Jews are huddled in refugee camps all over Europe, not knowing where to go or what to do, because obviously they do not feel comfortable returning to whether they lived in Germany or Poland or Austria or France. This was a place that turned on them in a horrible and frightening way. They want to go somewhere where they feel safe. And where is the traditional homeland? Palestine. Who's ruling Palestine? Great Britain. What did Great Britain promise to do in 1917 through the Balfour Declaration? They promised to create a Jewish homeland in Palestine. And of course, 30,000 plus Palestinian Jews fought with the British Army in World War II. So with all this unbelievable current pushing Great Britain to do a Jewish homeland in Palestine, Great Britain, of course, does everything in their power to prevent any of those Jewish refugees from immigrating into Palestine. And like, how could that possibly be? What could they have been thinking? Well, what Great Britain was thinking very clearly and very cynically is that whatever they had promised the Jews, there are 40 million Arabs in the surrounding countries. And these countries are being ruled by client kings of Great Britain. These kings are on Great Britain's side. But all of the people underneath these kings, they don't like Great Britain because of the betrayals that they felt like happened after World War I. They were kind of emotionally, if not physically, on the side of Nazi Germany. And so Great Britain is sitting on a knife's edge, and all of the oil they depend upon is in these countries. So when push came to shove, Great Britain said, you know what, I'm sorry, I know we promised, but you can't immigrate into Palestine. But after the Holocaust, and specifically after getting a lot of military training from Britain during World War II, there were a lot of Jews that just simply weren't having that. And they launched a campaign against Great Britain. And there was a lot of terrorism and bombings. They bombed the King David Hotel, killed hundreds of people. And eventually Great Britain finally threw up their hands and said, you know what? We're trying to pull back from this whole empire thing anyway. We're ready to leave Palestine. And they turned to the United Nations, the brand new United Nations, and said, hey, come up with a solution. And the United Nations said, we got it. Let's divide Palestine into a Jewish section and an Arab section. And since everybody wants Jerusalem, because it's a holy city for both Jews and Arabs and Christians and Muslims and Christians, then what we will do is we'll make that kind of a UN-administered open city. What do you guys think? And the Jewish people in Palestine immediately said, we love it, we vote for it. And the Arabs immediately said, there is no way we are tolerating a division of Palestine. This is our ancestral home for the last 1,000, 2,000 years, and there's no way we're sharing it with anybody. Now, Great Britain did pretty much so what they did in India. Guys, we don't have the money, we don't have the patience, we're pulling out. Have a nice life. And immediately, all the surrounding Arab nations invaded the Jewish sections of Palestine. And to everyone's shock, they lost. The Jews actually won the 1947-48 War of Independence, despite being overwhelmingly outnumbered. Now, of course, it takes more than just desperation and not having anywhere else to go to win a war. You need arms and so forth. And you may think the US supplied those arms, but we didn't. You know who did? The Soviet Union. And you might say, why would the Soviet Union help out Israel? For the next 75 years, every time something came up in front of the UN, the USSR was always against Israel. But they support them at this point in time because I think they knew we, as the Soviet Union, the #1 oil producer in the world, we don't need all this oil. Great Britain, Europe, America, they do. If we help establish a Jewish state in the middle of the Middle East, boy, is that going to create trouble for Western democracies, and boy, has it. So Stalin was super evil, but no one ever accused him of being dumb. All right, so thanks to Soviet Union support, the Israelis won, and there's also a little ironic historic note. The Soviet Union supported them out of arms factories in Czechoslovakia, which had been making arms for the German Nazi army. So when you see pictures of the War of Israeli Independence, they're flying planes and holding guns that you've seen in all the World War II movies being held by Nazis. All right, so fast forward across a lot of violence, a lot of horror, and Suez Crisis and so forth, because there was a ceasefire, but there was not a peace treaty. All right, and there was one other thing that will come back to haunt Israel and the world that also happened in 1947-48, and that is, as the Arab armies initially were winning, they would go into villages and they would kill Jewish people and they would drive them out. And then when the Jewish army started winning later in the war, when they would go into a village, they would kill Palestinian people and then drive them out. And since the Jews wound up winning the war, all of this territory that they occupied, there had been a huge flood of refugees out of this territory, about 750,000. Keep that number in mind because it's going to be a big problem in the future. All right, so 1947-48, War of Independence. Fast forward to 1967, Israel attacks all of the countries around it before they can attack it. It's called the Six-Day War, and again, to everyone's shock, Israel wins in, you guessed it, 6 days. And this becomes a big issue because in winning this war, they took over the Gaza Strip, they took over the West Bank, they took over the Golan Heights. All right, now the Golan Heights are very mountainous, not very populated, not a huge issue unless you're Syrian and you really want them back because there's good ski resorts there. Believe it or not, yes, there are. But Israel's never given this back, I don't think. So the big issue is where a lot of the people live. West Bank, Gaza Strip. All right? And the reason why this is such a huge problem is because Israel is now a colonial power. Why do I say that? Because they know, unlike when they conquered all this part, they know that there are Palestinians in these two areas that they are never going to give the right to vote. They are never going to make Israeli citizens. How did they know that? Well, right now in Israel, there are about 5 million people who are Jewish. There are about 2 million people who are Palestinian, and they are citizens of Israel, and they get a right to vote, and they run people for the Knesset, the parliament, and so they are citizens of Israel. All right, they may be second-class citizens, but they're definitely citizens of Israel. You add up the people here and here, and it's about 4.7 million. Add those to the existing Israeli Palestinian citizens, and guess what? They outnumber the Jewish citizens. And the one thing that the Jewish citizens of Israel are never going to allow is for them to be a minority in Israel. Because they've spent most of the last 2,000 years being a minority somewhere and being an oppressed minority. And the whole point of Israel is we're not going to be a minority anymore. We're going to control our own fate. Isn't anybody going to oppress us anymore? So, by taking these two places over, they knew they were going to be a colonial power. They knew they were never going to let these people actually be citizens of Israel. All right, now, so they've got to find some kind of solution. There's more war, there's more violence. In this case, the Yom Kippur War, all of Israel's neighbors decide to invade Israel before Israel can invade them again. And very nip and tuck as to whether Israel might lose that war. They ultimately wound up winning, but then after that, some folks, Egypt said, you know what, let's have peace. Jordan said, let's have peace. All the other folks were still saying, no, we're still all about war. But you started to get some movement. You started to get some hope that maybe there could be a solution to this intractable problem. In 1993, there were the Oslo Accords, where the Palestinian Authority was created. Israel said, we're not going to be a colonial power anymore. The Palestinians are going to elect their own leaders and they're going to rule themselves. Meanwhile, we'll negotiate to get a two-state solution, just like the UN envisioned way back in 48 or 47, and we will have peace in the world. Won't that be wonderful? And then they came upon a problem. Because remember, 5 million Israeli Jewish citizens. 2 million Palestinian Israeli citizens. All right? Remember how I said there were 750,000 refugees, Palestinian refugees from Israel. All right? That was 75 years ago. Those people and their descendants now number about 5 million. So, just as we knew they were never going to let these people be citizens because they would outnumber them, will Israel ever allow these 5 million people to come back to Israel and become full citizens? And the answer is no, because that plus that is more than this. And the Oslo Accords hung up on this for like 25 years, where they would say, all right, we need a two-state solution. And the Palestinians would say, well, first thing we got to get straight is this right of return. These 5 million people want to come back to their ancestral villages. They want their family's land. They want to come back home. And Israel would say, I can do this math. No, you can't come home. And then the Palestinians would say, well, you can't have peace. And then there'd be more violence and intifadas and horrible things. And they'd come back to the table and they'd say, we need a two-state solution. Well, first thing we got to talk about is these 5 million people. And Israel would say, they're not coming back. Well, then we can't have a state. And it's just been a non-stop, endless, intractable problem about what to do with these 5 million refugees and their desire to come back home. And it gets worse because there are two factions in the Palestinian electorate. There's Fatah, which is the descendant of the old PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, and then there is Hamas. All right? Fatah is two-state. We're all about the Oslo Accords. Hamas is one state, and it's an Islamic state because they are a client of Iran. Iran funds them, Iran organizes them. They're basically just an extension of the Iranian global terror army that's all over the world. But it's particularly prevalent all around here. All right? Now, with these two, Fatah in 2005, they suspended elections. There hasn't been an election in the West Bank or in Gaza since 2005 because Fatah was pretty sure that Hamas was going to win. And Hamas wasn't having that. Once the elections were suspended, there was a war in 2007 in Gaza, and Hamas won. So Gaza is ruled by Hamas, and the West Bank is ruled by Fatah, and nobody gets to vote because if they voted, they'd probably vote for Hamas. Now, this, and just when you think this couldn't get any worse, a bunch of folks in Israel looked at the fact that Hamas is really popular. And remember, Hamas is a one-state solution. We want no Jews in Palestine. in Palestine. We want to drive them out. Well, that created a lot of political support in Israel for a one-state solution. I agree with that, those Hamas folks. The only solution is one state, but of course it's going to be a Jewish state, not as an Islamic state. And we want to basically create settlements all in the West Bank and basically establish that we can take over the entirety of the West Bank. And you can see how this becomes like a downward spiral. Because the more settlements that the Jewish authorities in Israel put in the West Bank, the more convinced the Palestinians become that they're not serious about a two-state solution and they support Hamas. The more the Palestinians support Hamas, who want to drive all Jews out of Palestine, the more support there is for a one-state solution and driving the Palestinians out of Palestine. You can see how this is just an intractable, horrible mess that no one has been able to find a way to untie the Gordian knot. And one last thing that gets brought up is, well, so what though? I mean, at the end of the day, Hamas launches some rockets. Israel's got this Iron Dome system. Most of the rockets get shot down. Okay, they kill a dozen or so, Israeli citizens. Why does Israel respond with such overwhelming force? Why do they create such cruelty and bombing and civilian casualties and so forth in their fight against Hamas and these rockets? And the answer is that Israel doesn't see this as Hamas. They don't see it as the little bitty Gaza Strip that's really no threat to them. They see this as Iran. And Hamas is controlled by Iran. So is Hezbollah. I'm not even going to try and spell it. Hezbollah controls Lebanon right up here. And over here is Syria. And Bashar al-Assad, the ruler of Syria, he has survived the Arab Spring uprising. He is still in power entirely because of Iran. And he's part of a Shia minority that depends upon Iranian support. So there's Iranian control up here, Iranian control up here, and over here in Iraq, there are Iranian-sponsored militias, Shia militias, that are very close to being able to take over Iraq. So when Israel sees Hamas here, they don't see tiny little Gaza Strip, no threat. They see a spear tip in their vitals from Iran, and they overreact, and they kill a bunch of civilians every time these guys launch those rockets. And of course, that's probably part of the reason why Hamas launches those rockets. Because the one hope for some kind of peace is that that Egypt and Saudi Arabia, these are big, powerful Sunni countries, and they're as scared of Iran as Israel is. And Israel has been increasingly reaching out to these Sunni Arab powers to maybe create some kind of arrangement where they could create a structure that would allow for peace. But the one way you can make it really hard for Egypt and Saudi Arabia and Qatar and some of the other countries that are talking to Israel to keep talking to Israel, launch some rockets and have Israel overreact and create a bunch of civilian casualties. So, as I said at the very beginning of this, don't know any conceivable solution to the Gordian knot that is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But by laying out where the different pressure points and problems are, hopefully we can at least have our viewers understand a little bit more of this conflict. And the folks that are so quick to say the Israelis have the white hat and the Palestinians are evil, you probably ought to think about pulling back a little bit from that, because these are human beings that have very good motivations for the decisions they're making. And the people who are saying the Palestinians are wearing the white hat and the Israelis are evil, same thing. The Israelis are facing a really, really tough situation, and multiple times in their past they have been on the verge, the knife's edge of extermination as a people. And so ultimately the way forward is going to be when enough of the rest of the world decides that neither one of these folks have a white hat and we decide to find some middle ground that works for both sides. Thanks for joining us for Market Insights. We hope you found it informative. If you did, we hope you can like the video and share it with your friends. You can also find our other research pieces at caravelconcepts.com or by subscribing at the link below. Thanks.